Good morning, Seth. So nice to meet you.
Thanks for having me, Heidi. Nice to meet you as well.
So I am speaking with Set Hernandez, who is based in the US, whose latest work, Unseen, is a documentary that will be premiering at Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Film Festival. So congratulations on being selected at this festival. It's really exciting to be speaking with you about the film. But let's start with a bit of an intro and sort of information or some kind of tidbits about you and how you got into filmmaking.
Yes, so hi everyone. My name is Seth, as Heidi mentioned. Thanks again for having me. Where do I begin? So I guess maybe before I started filmmaking, I was doing a lot of community organizing, coming from my own experience, myself being an undocumented immigrant, and
Mhm,
the film really intertwines the experience of being undocumented with all these other intersectionalities also. And I think, that experience of being an undocumented immigrant has been an impetus for me, like for a lot of the things that I do, and even into community organizing and also filmmaking. And when I was younger, when I first started learning that I was undocumented and what that means, the representation of what undocumented immigration looks like, feels like,
mhm,
the topics around it was just very maybe monolithic, especially like about 15, 10 years ago. The main narrative was that there are these undocumented students and they want citizenship in the US in particular, and that citizenship is their biggest goal in life. And that is it, and they're all students and they're great and they're hardworking and all of that. But what I also noticed, is that there's no other kind of nuance to the experience. Some of us are not students, some of us
mhm.
maybe are not really sure what citizenship means for us. So it was just so like bland and
Mhm,
monolithic, and it didn't always represent the experience that I had and people
mhm,
in my family had, until I saw, I think especially, the rhetoric at the time also was primarily just on Latino immigrants, undocumented immigrants in the
mhm.
US, especially 10, 15 years ago.
Yes.
And I think it wasn't until I came across the filmmaking of Tam Tran, who is an
Mhm,
undocumented filmmaker herself, and she's of Vietnamese heritage, but was born in Germany. But because Germany doesn't give birthright citizenship, when she moved to the US, she became undocumented, but they weren't really sure where,
mhm,
if she were to get deported, where would she go, right? So, and then Tam was making a lot of these amazing, films from the undocumented perspective, and I think that undocumented perspective is kind of like what continues to ground me in how to navigate storytelling, because I feel like often also stories about undocumented people, about marginalized quote unquote communities, are made by people who are not from our community, told
mhm.
for audiences that are not from our community. And I'm tired of that. So how can we make a film about undocumented folks that's for undocumented people? And even though I am not disabled, there's also that intention of how do we make a film about disability that's also geared for people with disabilities?
Right, and I think that goes back to your point about intersectionality, and you bring up another important point about representation, which is sort of what's been lacking in this dialogue of being undocumented, especially in the US. So thank you for sharing that. It gives me really great perspective. Can you also maybe kind of center us around how you and your subject of Unseen, Pedro, kind of came to know each other? Because it appears to me that you kind of knew each other from a while before you started filming.
Yeah, so Pedro and I met when I was helping to run a program for undocumented young adults.
Mhm,
And the program was around healthcare access for everyone, including undocumented immigrants, because as probably folks know here in the US, healthcare, unfortunately, is not a right that everybody gets to have, you know. So
Mm-hmm.
I think when Pedro and I first met, you know, it was in this very professional setting. And, you know, there was really no desire at the moment to like make a documentary to begin with, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I just know that when I first met Pedro, you know, he really provided a lot of important perspectives that was often not included in the dialogue that we were having in the, you know, movement for immigrant justice, immigrant rights that I was a part of, especially for
Mm-hmm.
immigrant youth at the time. And I think, you know, when I was also organizing, you know, there was this rhetoric that like, you know, you have to, you know, like undocumented people deserve citizenship because they're, you know, hardworking, tax-paying, they contribute to, you know, like this country, you know, like with their labor. It's just like a very merit-based approach to dignity, you know, like you deserve dignity because you earned it. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like, you know, from in the course of like getting to learn more about Pedro, he always tells me that, you know, it's not so much about like doing things independently by yourself. It's about like leaning into each other as a community in interdependence, you know,
Right.
and I think in the course of that, you know, like that's kind of like where the friendship grew. I think Pedro, to your point, Pedro and I, like when we started filming, we were just like, you know, we were like, but like our friendship was still budding.
Mm-hmm.
But in the course of getting to film each other and in the course of filming, also you get to learn more about each other and we realize, wow, like there's a lot of similarities between us. We might not share a lot of identities together,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, the undocumented experience is a big part of our lives, and also other aspects of our journeys are so similar. So I think the friendship really grew in the
Mm-hmm.
course of the last few years, during the filming as opposed to before filming.
Right. Right, that gives me some interesting insight as well, because in the course of the film, you have some really candid conversations, just the two of you, because you allow us to sort of take part in that journey together. That where you talk about your similarities, but even about the point that you made about merit, and whether I think Pedro makes it really puts it in an interesting way where he said, if you really knew me, would you continue helping me? Like there's a lot of questioning around, even for himself, someone who is has limited sight now, in terms of the resources that he's sort of had access to, and whether it's that idea of being worthy of it. So I really appreciated those conversations between the two of you too, because it allowed us to see the same sort of theme, but from different perspectives. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, totally, totally, Heidi. Yeah. And I think also, you know, to your point, I think with the, there's so many ways to, I think part of the what the film is about is vulnerability, right? I think like maybe the title of Unseen, you know, someone told us like unseen maybe means what is not beyond just like what you see, quote unquote, because the film is not very much about sight. Also, like it's
Mhm.
also about what you show, right? And I
Right.
think one of the big like um one of the big themes that we navigate in the film, perhaps I argue, is vulnerability. You
Mhm.
know, to your point about perspective, I think sometimes from a distance or from the exterior, we assume certain things about people, or we assume certain things about communities,
Mhm.
but until we really get to know that person, until we really get to know that community, you know, maybe a lot of those things are just going to be assumptions and not really grounded in reality.
Yeah, it's a good point, because there are people who don't always interact with folks in similar situations like yourselves, in terms of being undocumented, and it
Mhm.
happens in other countries that are not just the U.S.
Right.
I live in Canada, and I know that's an issue here too, although maybe not to the extent that it's spoken about as in the U.S. I did have a bit of a curious question in terms of, I know you had these conversations that are in the film, but we don't see you in the film. Was that a decision that you made early on, that you might be part of it, but not necessarily see you in terms of like your face?
Yeah, so the film has been in the works for 7 years. Pedro and I
Mhm.
started filming in May 2016. Literally 7 years ago. It's now May
Mhm.
2023 for the record.
Yeah.
And the idea was that it's a film about Pedro. Like Pedro
Mhm.
is the only person that this film is going to focus on. The
Mhm.
idea that the filmmaker would appear didn't really happen until last year, to be honest.
Okay.
Like it was because I should also say, a lot of the ways the film ended up being shaped, I can't take credit for all of it. Maybe I really helped to guide it a certain direction,
Mhm.
but I think a lot of the seeds that were planted creatively were actually planted by my incredible collaborators.
Mhm.
Particularly, I want to give a shout out to Daniel Chavez Ontiveros, our
Mhm.
editor. When I was just editing by myself, for the first 5 years of the project, I think maybe if you are the filmmaker, editor, and like you don't, I feel like I didn't want to include myself because I'm like, that's just narcissistic. Why would I do that? Also, I don't want to hear my voice, like, and then Danielle comes along and it was like, I think we should really include you in the film, primarily because he noticed a lot of parallels between Pedro's experience and my experience,
Right.
and also shout out to my producing team because I think,
Mhm.
our producing team really also helped guide, the editor that we ended up, working with, and also having these feedback screenings, and during one of our first feedback screenings, the participants mentioned, yeah, we like having you in the film, and I
Mm.
was like, really? So all that to say, that decision didn't come about until, last year. And maybe I should say, maybe that's part of the interesting thing about making art,
Right.
and filmmaking. I was reading this article a couple of days ago about how poems, what this poet talks about, where he thinks poems come from.
Mhm.
And he says like poems, like just kind of like you look at something and poems just kind of show themselves to you, like in
Mhm.
the silence, things appear, you
Right.
know? And I feel like the way Unseen ended up, the final film that Unseen ended up being,
Mhm.
was not things that I originally ideated. It
Mhm.
was things that I kind of maybe gleaned, maybe things that I gathered, things that came to me, from the suggestions of everybody around the filmmaking collaboration that we've had, and also just pausing and the letting the film tell you where it wants to go. It's
Right.
kind of a weird analogy.
Well, yes and no, right? Because it is a process. And I think with
Yeah.
any kind of documentary filmmaking, that's what I hear, that it ends up being a collaboration. There's feedback there, and sometimes the story kind of, you start one way and it kind of veers you um,
Mhm.
into another way. So it sounds like it was, as long as even though it was a long journey, it still kind of came up in a way that I think does justice to what you were trying to do from the get-go. I'm curious about the format of the film, which I really appreciate the accessibility part of it. I know there's some interesting kind of cinematography in it because we sort of want to be immersed in Pedro's world. And I know there's descriptive language as well for almost all audiences. Was that something that from the beginning you had already discussed um, as being part of the film?
Yeah, so when it comes to that, yes, that definitely has been there from the beginning.
Mhm.
One of the ideas that we had is it was just me and Pedro for the first 5 years, to be honest.
Right.
And when I first started with filming with Pedro, I was like thinking and asking Pedro, like this is a film about you. You should be able to enjoy it just as much as everybody else, and I
Mhm.
think there's this common assumption, or maybe it's just the reality that film is a visual medium. But maybe film is, I argue that film is not just a visual medium though. I think
Mhm.
film is a medium like of sound, of immersion in many ways, So um one of the ideas for the film then is, how do we invite, so Pedro was the first person whom I learned audio descriptions from. Audio
Right.
descriptions pretty much, is that if you are blind, low vision, you can't see, there's an audio track that you can add to the film that allows you to um hear descriptions of what's visually appearing in the film. Did you watch it with audio descriptions, by the way, Heidi?
Um,
Or you
no,
watch? Got it, got it, got it. Okay. Yeah.
but
So aside from,
I am aware of that capacity.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. So with the film, then I learned from Pedro that he watches a lot of films in many ways, like by listening to them.
Right.
He
Hmm.
also introduced me to other media that's like audio based, and like maybe accessible for blind audiences, low vision audiences.
Hmm.
So then with that idea of inviting audiences to watch a film by listening, maybe the other way to navigate that also is, what if we dial down the visuals? What if we invite sighted people, when they watch the movie, to not lean so much into getting information from what they see, but rather from what they hear,
Hmm.
so then the visuals ended up becoming just supplementing the
Right.
audio in reality for the film. And we can never make the experience of an audience member who has different access needs from the experience of another person. We can never make those things the same, so how
Hmm.
do we how do we try our best so that it's at least as enjoyable as possible to everybody in a way that's really meaningful? But then now, because the film is sound based, we want to make sure also that the film can still be accessible for deaf and hard of hearing audiences,
Exactly.
right?
Hmm.
Hence the captions. So the film is open captions. You'll
Hmm.
notice that the film also has different colors for the captions. We
Yes.
really wanna invite audiences to have a really artistically meaningful experience, an enjoyable experience, even though that experience will be different for everybody based on their access needs.
Right. No, I think it's great. It's also great for folks who are also still learning English, maybe as well. Like I was thinking about that too, because
There you go.
I've been there myself where I relied a lot on captions when I was learning English as a kid. So,
I still rely on captions, to be honest.
well,
So,
sometimes I do too, because
especially when I watch TV.
yes, yeah, no,
Yeah,
you're right. And sometimes that's just helpful, regardless of your own needs physically, right? Um,
exactly.
So I am curious to as well in terms of what Pedro thinks about the final version of the film. I don't know if he's had a chance to experience it with you in terms of.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I hate talking on behalf of Pedro, but because he's not here, maybe I'll paraphrase some of the things that I know to be
Mhm.
true based on what he also says in the film, right? So, I should say that Pedro, like I mentioned, Pedro and I were working on the film alone by ourselves for the first 5 years. That
Mhm.
means that Pedro has been, you know, like contributing and getting to, watch cuts of the film with us, because that's of our intention. I want to make sure this is a film about Pedro, like he needs to know
Mhm.
how he's being portrayed. Like, how would I feel if someone makes a film about me? And I
Right.
think there's also this dynamic, right? I think that's the big thing in the documentary field, right? For example, if I was making a movie about a powerful person like, I don't know,
Mhm.
Justin Trudeau, like maybe also coming from the lens of, like journalism, maybe I'm not gonna show Justin Trudeau every cut that I have,
Right.
because
Right. Mhm.
like he's a powerful person, and maybe to a certain extent, like the society needs to scrutinize what these powerful people are doing,
Right.
and if there are things that are questionable that this powerful person is doing, if they ask me to take it out because they don't want me to, like to air out, the dirty deeds that they're doing, Of course I'm we gotta interrogate that process. But in this case, you know, Pedro is not, like a prime minister. Pedro is not a president, you
Right.
know, and I feel like I want to make sure that, like people who, especially also, from undocumented community, often we are placed in very vulnerable situations.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we, as filmmakers, storytellers, really be cognizant of not putting people in further risk, right? And I think that's why, getting to really invite Pedro to get a sense of how he's being portrayed in the film, I think is really important. So all this to say, Pedro has indeed watched the final cut of the film, and as even says in the film, spoiler alert, maybe not that big a spoiler, he
Right.
says, I that he has found a certain level of healing, that
Yes.
the making
Mhm.
this film has contributed to his own healing journey, and I think, like, as a filmmaker, when we've working on something for so long, to a certain extent, I think that's the biggest prize that I could ever ask for. That
Mhm.
the person I've been working with all this time has felt affirmed by the process, has felt like I understood him. Because that's the thing too with the film, my goal has always been, you know, whatever critics say, whomever, these, big critics, like whatever they think, I think for me the biggest accomplishment is for Pedro to experience and watch the film and say, you understand me, Seth, this film is really about me, so, and to my understanding so far from Pedro, that's kind of been the feedback I've been getting.
Yeah, no, I thank you for sharing that. I actually think there's a need to hear these stories from the source, and you've allowed Pedro to do that, to share his experience, his vulnerabilities, his doubts, his successes, right? And navigating all of that as well, in this sphere of being undocumented, but also um, with a challenge in terms of limited vision. So thank you so much for that. I'm looking forward to seeing what the reactions are here at the festival. What is next? Is the festival touring anywhere? Will it open in the US hopefully at some point?
Yeah, so actually this month is quite busy for us. Um, at the very same time that we're screening at Hot Docs on for our second screening. So our first screening is on May 3rd, our world premiere. Maybe I should also note, Heidi, because of Pedro's immigration status and my immigration status being undocumented,
Mhm.
we're not attending Hot Docs physically because we can go to, Toronto. Indeed, we just can't return back to the
It's the
US
way
because of
back.
our immigration status. And I
Okay.
think the festival journey in a way is like really showing the, like, whatever is being talked about in the film as an issue, it's actually happening in real life, as we navigate the film festival journey.
Mhm.
So while the film is screening at Hot Docs on our first second screening on May 6th, we will actually be having our US premiere here also in Los Angeles at the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival. And from there, we will also be screening. From there, the following week, we will be having our Bay Area premiere here in the West Coast of the US at the CAMFest, Center for Asian American Media Film Festival. So we have quite a few festivals coming up, more for the summer and the fall, and also as we navigate the journey of distribution ahead. So maybe folks can, follow us at Watch Unseen Film or also on our website, unseen-film.com, to keep updated about where you can find Unseen next.
Excellent. I'll be sure to put that in the description so people are aware. Thank you so much, Sid, for speaking with me. I wish you much success and my best to Pedro as well. And thank you, him, for sharing his story with us. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh my gosh, Heidi, thank you so much for making time. I'm receiving all your good words and I'm going to relay them back to Pedro.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.